English poet who became the poet laureate of England. Dryden was born in 1630 and died in 1700. So he is basically a generation and a half beyond Shakespeare. But it is from Dryden that we get the wonderful anecdote. And it may well be accurate. Johnson thought it was accurate that at one point, when Shakespeare was discussing Romeo and Juliet with his colleagues in the English theater, he remarked that he needed to kill Mercutio in Act 3 because if he hadn't done so, Mercutio would kill the rest of the play.
Mm.
And that's just such a wonderful, wonderful anecdote about Shakespeare. It's not necessarily apocryphal, although it might be. So the first thought unit that we were going to talk about is Johnson's recalling Dryden's repetition of these words, purportedly and possibly from Shakespeare himself. The second thought unit that we thought we would talk about is really relates to Shakespeare's extraordinary skill as a dramatist and as a dramatic artist and a dramaturge, and really brings to mind George Bernard Shaw's famous comment about Shakespeare. He used to describe him as the wily William. And the question that Roland and I were talking about is this wonderful progression in this play, which really tracks the arc of the play itself from light in the first instance and the first acts to darkness, ultimately culminating in the deepest darkness of the terrible events in the sepulchre below ground. So this progression of light to dark in Romeo and Juliet, and what that teaches us about Shakespeare's extraordinary artistry, not just in poetry, not just in character development, but also in utilizing all of the parts of the drama in the mind of his audiences. And then the third thing that we wanted to talk about is this fascinating duality between the characters of Romeo on the one hand and Juliet on the other. And Romeo, in many respects, is the heedless boy throughout. And that's not in any sense to impugn the intensity or the meaningful nature of his passionate love for Juliet, but he's a boy throughout the play. Whereas Juliet, who starts as a girl of 13 or 14, changes through the play. And by Act 5, we've seen Juliet become someone of deep agency, deeper self-knowledge, and someone who in many respects has become a real person in this play, which her lover, not to impugn the intensity or the reality of his love, never achieves. And then the fourth thought unit that we thought we would kick around, which I've always been fascinated by, is that this play was written, we think, in 1595. And 1595 was an interesting year in the arc of Shakespeare's greater artistic achievement. He was 31 at the time, and it is also the year in which he wrote Midsummer Night's Dream. And the thing that is so fascinating to contemplate and to discuss about Shakespeare as an artist is in the same year he writes Romeo and Juliet. He also writes Midsummer Night's Dream. And in Act 5 of Midsummer Night's Dream, you will all remember the hilarious slapstick comedy of the Rude Mechanicals presentation of the story of Pyramus and Thisbe. And it's some of the funniest slapstick any dramaturge has ever put up on the stage. It's really, uproariously funny. But then when you step back for a minute and you think about it, you realize that the plot in the subplot of Pyramus and Thisbe that's being presented as a slapstick comedy in Act 5 of Midsummer Night's Dream is exactly the same plot that reappears in the same year of his writing in Romeo and Juliet. You have two lovers separated by circumstance. One of them goes off. They intend to meet and they don't meet up. one of them winds up believing that his lover has been killed and eaten by a lion, kills himself, and when Thisbe returns, she finds Pyramus dead, and then she kills herself. It's exactly the plot that we see as this iconic tragedy in Romeo and Juliet. And we see in the exact same year from this author, we see this as enormously funny slapstick retelling of what was originally, we think, a Babylonian story of the story of Pyramus and Thisbe. So those were the four things Roland and I thought we'd talk about. So Roland, let's jump back to Mercutio. What do you think?
Okay.
What do you think about Dryden's comment, purportedly quoting Shakespeare?
Well, so if supposedly Dryden said, as you mentioned, that he had to kill off Mercutio or he would have taken over the play or he would have ruined the play in some fashion. I guess what I would say about that is that there is a kind of underlying um, issue there, which I think that comment points to, which is that at least this is my interpretation, until the death of Mercutio, we can't be 100% sure that this is going to be a tragedy. With that death, the play reaches a kind of a fork in the road, and from that point on, it becomes unquestionably a tragedy. And the transitional moment is the moment in which Mercutio is fatally wounded, Act 3, Scene 1, where Romeo says to him, what does he say? He says, courage, man, the hurt cannot be much. And Mercutio says, and this is sort of one of the last comic speeches in the play, really, and it's like the play's farewell to comedy. He says, no, about his own wound. He says, no, 'tis not so deep as a well, nor so wide as a church door, but 'tis enough, 'twill serve. Ask for me tomorrow, and you shall find me a grave man. I am peppered, I warrant, for this world, a plague on both your houses. And so there is when the play loses Mercutio, it loses a kind of a commentator on events that would have been a kind of uh, uh, distraction from the kind of emotional intensity that the play cultivates in us from this point on around the fate of the two young lovers. Mercutio, of course, is a kind of ironic, sometimes a kind of sardonic figure about this. Also, sometimes a very, he is also a kind of imaginative, he has a kind of imaginative intensity of his own with Queen Mab and all that. But he adds a dimension to the play that quickly becomes superfluous at the point when the play is determined that it's going to be a tragedy. So I always take that speech of his just before he dies as being the sort of the last comic speech in the play. And of course, it's tragic comic, really, because it's bitterly comic about somebody prophesying his own imminent death. But also, it's a kind of reminder of what kind of commentary that we would have for the rest of the play if Mercutio had lived.
It's interesting, Roland, because that dovetails very much in this question of this sort of progression from light to dark, because these are all scenes that take place in daylight. Some of them are almost comic. I bite my thumb at you. Do you bite my thumb at you? The kind of back and forth between these Capulets and Montagues and the street brawls among the servants and the retainers in the houses. But it's all it's all in light. And in some ways, I think that's an extraordinarily astute observation, because if you think back to the back and forth between Capulets and Montagues in the street in the daylight, it could easily go towards comedy. It could easily feel like some of Shakespeare's comic productions, many of which have extensive violence in them as well. It's not as though there's no reason to think that violence would be shorn out of a Shakespearean comedy. And that is the moment, that sense of Mercutio's last speech is this sense of the darkening gyre of this play. I think you're absolutely right that that's the hinge, and all of a sudden, it's a really steep shoot into the much deeper and more tragic elements of the play. Um, it is your I think both you and Dryden and Johnson and probably Shakespeare were absolutely right. It would be very hard to have the rest of the play if Mercutio were still alive, because Mercutio would be laughing at the
Yeah.
ridiculous aspects of Romeo's feckless transition from his earlier girlfriend to Juliet. Mercutio would actually impugn both, not so much the sincerity, but Mercutio would impugn the meaningfulness of
Yeah.
Romeo's transition to his love for Juliet in ways that would make the rest of the tragedy unsustainable. I mean,
Yes.
it's a Dryden's comment, or could easily have been lodged in Shakespeare. So what do you think, Roland? Is Dryden reporting something which the English theater had preserved for 30 or 40 years as being an actual comment from the wily William?
I think it probably is. Yeah,
I
probably.
do too. I've
Close
always
enough.
thought it had a verisimilitude about it that was very
Yeah.
real.
He's close enough to Shakespeare's lifetime that it probably is the kind of lore that would have been preserved and be pretty accurate, I would think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree with that. I really do agree with that. Um,
Dan, can I say something about the light to dark transition?
Absolutely. That is just where we had arrived.
So, two things that occur to me about that. One of them is that, as you know very well, and probably many people watching us know this, in Shakespeare's time, their ideas about what constituted a tragedy came indirectly from Aristotle. And if you were a member of Shakespeare's generation, you were the beneficiary of the fact that Aristotle's Poetics had been translated into European languages relatively recently. And so it was accessible to somebody like Shakespeare. He probably read it in Italian, or he probably heard about it and was able to investigate it for himself. Now, Aristotle has all kinds of descriptive accounts of what tragedy in his own time was like. That's what the Poetics is as a treatise. But in later eras, and in the Renaissance especially, people tended to take it prescriptively rather than descriptively, that perhaps the things that Aristotle was observing empirically about the tragedy of his own time, perhaps these things should be taken as rules. And one of the things that and so the question of, I mean, Shakespeare doesn't do most of what Aristotle prescribes, but the idea is lurking there for everybody in that generation, is that if you're gonna take liberties with those principles of tragic composition, you'd better have a good justification for departing from them. You better know what you're doing. And one of Aristotle's descriptive observations about plays in his own time and tragedies is that they have unity of time. They take one day. And beyond that, it becomes, he thinks there's something unnatural about representing a longer period of time. Now, how long does Romeo and Juliet take? 4 or 5 days, something like that, from the beginning of the play to the end. It's very short. It's a short period of time if you look at it in terms of the emotional transitions that Romeo and Juliet undergo from the beginning to the end. But it is not one day. If you are Shakespeare and you are trying to impress on your more literal-minded contemporaries that you don't need to write a tragedy that takes one day, but nonetheless you can create a kind of implied, abstract unity, what would you do? You would take a play that starts in light and ends in dark, like a kind of notional day, but it's not a literal day. It's not a calendar day. It's a kind of symbolic day, abstract day. So the play starts out with a lot of imagery and commentary on light and scenes, as you mentioned, that evoke kind of brightness and lightness, and it ends in this utter darkness. And I think that that's a kind of virtual day that he's using as a way of nodding to the classical understanding of tragedy without actually honoring it in his own way.
Oh, Roland, that is such an interesting comment. And it also, it speaks to our sense of Shakespeare as a consciously evolving artist.
Yeah.
Not, that there's that, that I, as soon as you said that, I really thought, okay, this is a window into the mind of a 31-year-old just coming into greatness
Yeah.
as a dramatic artist. And I think that's absolutely brilliant. I really, really like that. Like
It's
that.
also it also has a kind of virtuosic sort of show off element to it for
Yeah.
his contemporaries. Like anybody can condense a plot into one day, but can you create this kind of virtual sensation of light to dark over several days merely through the language? And is anybody else able to do that in his time? So it's got an element of watch me, watch my interpretation of what unity of time could mean in a play like this.
And boy, that's so consonant with our sort of emotionally intuitive sense about who Shakespeare really was and the
Yeah. And there's
extraordinary
another thing,
event.
which is about the transitions, which is that the from light to dark is one of the transitions, but there's a lot of transition of language over the course of the play. So, for example, if you look at in general, the play goes from kind of densely figurative language at the beginning to a much plainer and looser and more sort of almost colloquial kind of language toward the end. And if you want to look at a contrast in this, look at Romeo's first speech about Rosalind
Yeah.
in Act 1, Scene 1. It starts about line 108, in which he sounds like the speaker of a love sonnet from that era, in that period at the beginning of the 1590s, the first half of the 1590s or so. What was really in fashion was the kind of love poetry that had been written in the previous decade by somebody like Sir Philip Sidney. His sonnet sequence, Astrophel and Stella, was published posthumously in 1591 and created a kind of sensation for a few years in which people imitated Sidney's kind of very, very extravagant, very highly figurative sonnets about unrequited love. At the beginning of the play, that's what Romeo sounds like, and it almost sounds like he's getting it right from a
The
model like
book.
Sidney. You get
Yeah.
to the end of the play and look at his last speech, Act 5, Scene 3, after the killing of Paris, and he sounds like a completely different person. And so what Shakespeare's trying to do there, I think, is create another level of transition from the beginning to the end of the play, so that we feel that even though it's 5 days, it has a kind of portentous duration feeling that we might not otherwise expect in such a short span of time.
It's so interesting in the sense that this also speaks to, yeah, and I have a sense that, Roland, that you and I are also speaking directly to Tom Stoppard, because the way Tom Stoppard put together the construct in Shakespeare in Love and that wonderful screenplay that he did, at the end, Shakespeare wins the bet about being able to put the tragedy in more contemporary terms on stage, and that's Stoppard's insight about that is almost it's very congruent with what we've just been discussing, and I mean, from one great playwright to another, that's that's some useful validation.
Mhm.
So let's talk a little bit about Romeo and Juliet as characters
Mhm.
as well, and in the remarkable way in which Juliet becomes a person as she evolves in this. Clearly, it's more than the fact, which would have been understood both by Shakespeare and by his audience, that Juliet was far more committed in social construct, having slept with Romeo. There's no way back from Juliet, from this relationship. Whereas Romeo was still, sort of the Benedict of the
Mhm.
play, if need be. But there's something more going on. It's not just a social construct that Juliet finds as she realizes something about herself, I think.
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, this is sort of the gateway to the middle period of Shakespeare's career in which he becomes interested in female characters that have an unusual amount of self-knowledge and agency. And it shows up in not only in a tragedy like this, but it will shortly appear in As You Like It and Merchant of Venice and a number of other plays from this sort of the middle to the later part of this decade of the 1590s. And, part of it is clearly, we always have to remember this, it is that Shakespeare clearly had access to a boy actor who could, because these plays, there, as you know, there were no women who were actors at this time. He clearly had access to a boy actor who had the depth to be able to carry off these roles. He wouldn't have written it otherwise. He wrote everything for the company that he had available to him. And clearly, a part like Juliet or Rosalind or Portia, these parts would have been written for an actor who had an unusual depth and who could convey the qualities that you just were talking about. So I think part of it is that it's the beginning of a period in which he's starting to explore female characters who are not merely types, or who don't exist merely to further the plot or to hold down a kind of complementary place, and in something like Midsummer Night's Dream, where most of the female characters are much more sort of two-dimensional. In part, that's the design of that kind of a play. Clearly, that play like that exploratory move of what to do with a female character to enlarge her and enrich her, that hasn't quite hit yet in Midsummer Night's Dream, but it appears here, and I think it's really the first place where we start to see it.
It's interesting. It's carrying her to her doom. I mean, it actually enhances the tragic character of this play, and it's part of the reason I think why audiences for more than 400 years have found it so powerful. I don't think people mourn Romeo in the same way, but they mourn Juliet almost intuitively and
Yeah,
emotionally engaged in ways um, that are, that really speak to this. It's interesting, this idea that Juliet is in a sense she's a forerunner of the extraordinary women characters that he creates thereafter. Um, and I think that makes him, at least in my reading, yours is far broader. I think that makes him almost unique among his contemporaries and the
oh yeah, yeah,
generation, and is his interest in this question, and his interest in its understanding of women as having agency,
yep.
even regardless of the power and the overwhelming weight of the social constructs which otherwise restricted them. It's it's interesting to speculate whether, to some degree, this idea may have possibly been lodged in him by his own personal experiences, but it may also possibly have been lodged in him by his contemporary political observations of the Virgin Queen.
Absolutely. No,
Uh,
absolutely. If you wanted to represent something that was very much visible in the society and on people's minds, it would be a woman of unusual power and presence. And that's exactly what Queen Elizabeth I was in their time. And it is partly a way of complimenting her. Sometimes he compliments her quite directly, but something like this is the beginning of a kind of exploratory motion that he undergoes in this period in which he starts to think of ways of representing female agencies in ways that probably complement her indirectly. Yeah.
it's that wonderful novel that was published a couple of years ago by Maggie O'Farrell, Hamnet. Um, to me, the most interesting and strongest part of that novel was its reconceptualization of Anne Hathaway as a woman of profound agency, one whose agency was entirely bound up with her physical environment and with her place in Stratford and the Forest of Arden, and who would never have been able to translate to London or to Shakespeare's world of the theater. But the sense of Anne in that novel, it's just a novel, but although it's a very good novel, as a person of genuine intellectual and emotional weight with genuine agency of her own, is also interesting in this. It's it always seems that history has given her unduly short shrift, and that it is possible that they married because they recognized in each other significant intellectual and emotional gifts that were not necessarily the mind run at the time. So let me turn to our last hook before we throw this open for everybody's comments and thoughts and ideas. And that is this astounding, it can't possibly be described as a coincidence of Shakespeare's writing in the same year a play of the slapstick Pyramus and Thisbe, and a play which has become one of the iconic tragedies in the Western canon of Romeo and Juliet, with exactly the same plot. I mean, identically the same plot. And that's just an amazing thing to think about a little bit. And I think I don't know, Roland, whether you were intuitively suggesting a moment ago that MSND probably came first, but that seems like a possibility to me. I don't know what your sense of that might be.
Well, I guess so. As you know, the context, first of all, is that the public theaters were closed for what, about almost 2 years, from in the early 1590s, because of plague. And in that period, Shakespeare, it was sort of like our experience of the pandemic, in that period, just as a lot of people um, came out of our pandemic, looking at things differently, perhaps with different activities, and having experienced, new ways, new things. Shakespeare's drama, which was just getting going before that period, really kind of deepened during that period. And somewhere in there, toward the end of that time, so 1594, and then roughly 1595, he would have emerged with several plays, not only Midsummer Night's Dream, but Richard II and Romeo and Juliet. So think of it, one major comedy, arguably the first major comedy, the first major tragedy, the first major history play, right? And each of them was the best of its kind that he had written up to that point. The ones before that seemed like sort of lesser compared to these three. So clearly something deepened in him during that period in which the theaters were suspended. And I don't know how we would ever know whether Midsummer Night's Dream appeared first or Romeo and Juliet. We have performance records and things like that, but it's hard. Those things are kind of unreliable.
It's
But
hard to tell.
clearly, he wants the audience to experience the enjoyment of whatever order anybody might have seen them in. As an audience member, he wants people to experience the kind of sense of enjoyment that comes from the same story that on one day is represented tragically, and the same story on another day is represented strictly for laughs. And having the recognition of those two things side by side, almost perhaps they could be almost consecutive days, if you, in notional terms, just imagine it, you'd experience them almost one right after the other. It doesn't really matter what the order is, I think, but suddenly, it's another virtuosic move. It's a way of saying, look, I can take this old material and I can make it work this way, or I can do it this way. And in each case, I can give you, the kind of enjoyment that is specific to that kind of genre.
Well, and of course, the Globe did in fact run as a business in what we would describe as a kind of quasi-repertory, and it is perfectly conceivable that these plays would be presented on sequential days, in sequential performances, in any order,
Right.
largely depending, my suspicion, my strong suspicion, retroactively, is largely depending on the box office,
Right.
because these these guys were the equivalent of Hollywood screenwriters of today.
Sure.
They were definitely, they had many other objects, but they were definitely in it for the money. And the idea of these, I love your idea of Shakespeare's sense of almost bravura performance of being offered this divergent treatment of the same story in repertory in the same year is a wonderful way to think about the poet as he grows into his period of true greatness in the late 1590s and the early 1600s.
I mean, one thing
Oh,
to imagine is
oh,
just
sorry, go ahead.
imagine just one quick thing. Imagine, in the case of Midsummer Night's Dream, the role of Thisbe is played by Francis Flute,
Right.
the bellows mender, I believe. And imagine casting the actor who played Juliet as Francis Flute so that the audience would see
Roland, you're ahead of us all on
where
that.
this
That's
goes.
wonderful.
Yeah.
That's absolutely great. That's absolutely great. And of course, the actors, and just to pick up on Roland's both insightful and amusing comment, which is that we do know that individual actors, including the boy actors, had their own followings
Oh,
among
yes.
the Elizabethan audience, and people would go to see particular actors. They would go to see Kemp or Arman or Condell or Hemmings. They to say nothing of of the greats, but there really were, that is a very conceivable thing. And I now see that our disciplined friend Carla is now telling us that it's time for Roland and I to sit back and to hear questions and comments from our friends and supporters online. So Carla, we turn this over to you for managing.
Great. Okay. I put a question in the chat, y'all. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll uplift. For those of you who have submitted your questions beforehand, thank you so much. Now I'm going to find some of these. And we were talking about, I want to get back to, because we have some questions about the character of Juliet. Why is she so young? And they're youthful, like, is it love or is it youthful lust? And the age is 13, it's so young. And during that time period, I believe in Elizabethan England, the average wedding age, marriageable age, is really in their 20s. It's very similar to now.
Right.
So
Right.
why 13? Why is Juliet like all of a sudden pushed into that? And having so much, those are the things that I'm picking up from a couple of questions that have been submitted.
Well, I'll jump in with just one observation about that, which I have no way of supporting this, but I feel it, which is that part of what we see in Juliet is her moving past these very constraining social and emotional strictures and bonds. And in a sense, that makes sense for someone who is moving out from under both her mother and her mother in particular, and her father, her nurse, and the constructs which would surround a young woman who was conceivably marriageable in Renaissance Italy, perhaps, but obviously young by the felt sensibility of an Elizabethan audience, as you correctly point out. But I think in some respects that Shakespeare may have seen that as a useful dramatic construct to put her in a position where she has to move beyond these constraints. Roland, what's your?
I think that's exactly right. I think, first of all, if you just leave the romantic love out of it, she is the age at which for reasons of family alliances, one would contract a marriage of a very young girl before anybody else can lock her up, and you would, and that's normal in social and economic terms. But then you join that to the fact that in personal terms, this particular girl is, we're catching her in the play at just a transitional moment in which from girlhood to womanhood, and you can almost watch it happen in the play. It's like almost another one of these virtuosic things where he wants to show you how would you condense the transition from girlhood to womanhood into a few hour, 2 hours on a stage with some speeches, and so the convergence of all those things, I think, makes it makes a lot of sense that she's exactly the age that she is. Yeah.
Great. I see there's a few questions coming through or that have come through prior to about our particular production versus the play Romeo and Juliet.
Yes.
And why is this set in the early 60s? What is the connection there? And also how to justify doing this play now, where the tragedy is these very young people who are in their teens fall in love so quickly, but then they take their lives into their own hands. And thus, they mention multiple times in the play that they are committed to self-harm.
Yes.
And the trusted adults that they have in their life, the nurse and the friar, are not enough.
They let them
And that
down. They
they let them
affirmatively
down,
let
and
them down.
they still how would you frame that in today's age of that these two characters commit suicide at the end, and how is that connected to today with
Well,
these themes?
let me jump in for a second, but I also want to add that we have the brilliantly gifted director of this production on this very show. And so, in a couple of minutes, I really do want to hear from Katya's ideas about this. But I do want to say, because this was something that we came up with in the years in which I was a trustee at Shakespeare's Globe, we did several productions of Romeo and Juliet, one through the education department and one main stage with the wonderful Ola Ince as the director, probably one of the most talented young directors of color in the UK theater scene. She's just great. And both of those productions really focused intently on the idea of what a terrible, poisonous, disastrously bad choice suicide is for young people, period. Full stop. No romanticism about this. This is not a romantic tragedy. This is a story about dire and disastrous endings from bad adolescent choices. And I've always seen, Roland and I were talking about this the other day when we were talking about this. I mentioned I've always seen the nurse as really a rather dark and almost an evil character in the play. But Roland, what's your take on this? And then we should actually hear from Katya to hear her discuss this a little bit.
Well, the great critic Frank Kermode wrote somewhere, I remember, that in Romeo and Juliet, male and female are separate nations, and you could just as easily say that adults and kids are separate nations in this play. They are the kids. I call them kids, but who begin the play more or less as children or young teenagers, and who end the play as the tragic protagonists. They have a kind of insight, especially by the end, and a kind of understanding of their condition that the adults don't have. And they are very, I think one of the points that the play makes is that they are very badly served by Friar Lawrence and the nurse, and they are impulses of theirs that could be directed into other things, or insights about themselves that could be fruitful for them, end up bringing them to their ruin. And so I think it's it's partly about, in a way, about how poorly served the young people are in this society. And it starts from the duels and the feuds and everything all the way to, it's a play that represents older people as very foolish and very much caught up in things that don't matter, whereas the children, ironically, are the ones who have a far-sighted vision of things and see beyond what's right in front of them. And so, but at the same time, they are under siege by all of these emotions that they're experiencing for the very first time, and so they make bad choices.
Katya, do you want to? Would you like to comment about a little bit about this? We'd love to hear. It's a brilliantly directed production, by the way, for those of you who haven't yet seen the touring company. You're muted, Katya.
There we go. Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can. Yes.
A bit of a tech knave. Well, I have to argue that I'm on Team Nurse. So I don't see her as malevolent at all. I see her as trying to look out for Juliet, first for her heart, and then after Romeo is banished, for her well-being. And she's had sex. There's this marriage set up, with Paris. It's like to her, it's like, this is a good solution. She doesn't see that any other way for Juliet, and I think she's looking out for her best interest. Yes. Friar Lawrence, I do feel like has more ego and political skin in the game, and he's like, oh, this will be great, and so I see him as, in his desire to bring about this peace, he's short-sighted, and has total wishful thinking, like, oh yay, they're going to get married and it's all going to be better. And it's like, nah, maybe not.
Katya, can I ask,
yeah,
would you please share with folks about the choice to set this particular production in the early 60s?
Yeah, I wanted to set it at a time where, it was before the Vietnam War protests were starting. It was just before all that was happening. There was definitely civil rights, but there's a way in which, when you don't have a unifying war to use all your pent-up testosterone on, the young men then just turn on each other, and it's just like, well, if I can't fight him, who can I fight? So that's why I wanted to set it in the 60s, and I love the music, and I also love that it's at that time there were a lot of clothes for women in particular that were very romantic. It was and for men, it was people were thinking about romance. So yeah, that was one of the reasons I decided to set it then.
Interesting.
I have one final question that came in through the chat, but I do want to acknowledge it's 12:55. We're about to wrap things up, but I do want to uplift this one, and I want folks to comment in the chat. What is your favorite modern reimagining of Romeo and Juliet?
What a
why?
And it's such an iconic. It has been at this point.
There's so many iterations of this play. We've got Shakespeare in Love that, Dan, you were bringing up. That Stoppard's play of Shakespeare in Love, and that screenplay. We've got the music from Romeo plus Juliet. What is your favorite one? Put it in the chat, y'all. I'm going to go ahead and just say right now, Warm Bodies.
Yes.
Um,
And Carla,
Zombies, I'm
will you
in.
read
I'm
some of
in.
these out? Will you read some of these out as they're posted? Because Roland, I would love to see and hear them.
Absolutely. Um, at this point, like I think that's it. Like y'all share in the chat, write your, okay, West Side Story. Yes, yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Shakespeare in Love.
Yes.
Mine is Romeo plus Juliet because my dearest friend, Sidney Gilner, did script supervision on that film. And
It's a great film. It's a
yeah,
very good film. It's a very good film.
I'm seeing productions that folks are in, West Side Story, The Complete Works, um, abridged by the Reduced Shakespeare Company.
I'm a
And it's like,
traditionalist. I'm a traditionalist. I think the one that I've liked the best was an old RSC production that was just, right down the middle of the traditional English canon. Roland, what about you?
I am the exact age in which the one that had the most impact was the Zeffirelli film.
Yes. Roland, you're getting a lot of applause from people on the screen.
that is definitely an iconic production. All right, y'all. Feel free, keep loading up the chat with your favorite modern interpretation or modern take on Romeo and Juliet. For those of you who have to drop off, thank you so much for spending your lunch break or wherever, because we know folks are coming to us from all over. Thank you for spending your time with us on this latest reiteration of Let's Talk About. Please
And
consider.
let's give a big internet hand to Roland for joining us. It's just great. We are so grateful, Roland. It's wonderful that you're becoming part of the San Francisco Shakespeare, the intellectual part of the San Francisco Shakespeare family.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Watch this space soon. And y'all, if you haven't come through, check out the touring production of Romeo and Juliet. It's listed on our website, those public performances. We have the Two Gentlemen of Verona will be coming up in the summer, free to a park near you. And if you've enjoyed this and would like to support us, please consider a donation for the work that we do at SF Shakes, where we feel like all of this should be accessible and available for everyone. So please go ahead and if you're so inclined, if you're so moved, sfshake.org/donate. And thank you, everyone.
And thank you all for joining us. Have a great day. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Thank you, Katya, for jumping in. Oh, you're muted again, lady.
Yeah, it was.
Have we stopped recording?
About to.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, that was
Great.
fun.